In part 2, we're going to take a look at getting the case refinished. That's coming up right after this. Alright, so part 2 is going to include removing the Invicta branding off the case side, crown, case back, and bringing it back to a high polish. So first, let's take a look at the supplies that I use to work on the case. First up is a small table vise I got from a local tool store. It opens to a max of about 2.5 inches, I think, but also pivots and rotates, which makes it perfect for holding the case. Then I have a rotary tool that I used for sanding and polishing. I use the sanding and felt wool polishing wheel attachments that you see here. I also have a regular polishing cloth. Then there is a larger polishing cloth that I use to protect the case when I put it into the vise. You can use like a smallish towel or anything else you want to substitute for that. Then there's a variety of grit sandpaper. And lastly is the Blue Magic metal polishing cream. As we go through the process, I'll suggest some different things based on lessons that I learned after completing my first project. Now, the first time I used the vise, I used styrofoam squares to secure the case in the vise and keep it from getting damaged. But I suggest using the larger polishing cloth, like you'll see later when I'm polishing. As you use the rotary tool to sand, the case heats up and some of the styrofoam will melt onto the case. Now, it's easy enough to get off, but it just adds an extra bit of work for you. Now also, when I first tried this, I didn't remove the crystal, although I did on the second case. Now if you leave it in, just be careful not to crack it or damage it with the rotary tool. You can use a piece of painter's tape to cover it up if you'd like. Okay, so first we're getting the Invicta branding off the side of the case, and I use the sanding attachment on the rotary tool. Now this particular rotary tool has multiple speeds, and I had it set to 5 out of 8 for most of this work, but you can use the setting that you find makes the tool easier for you to control. Now you want to keep your motion across the case as even as possible. I suggest moving it across in one direction along the case, over and over until all the branding is gone. Now this takes a bit of practice, but if you apply uneven pressure or don't have the tool level against the case as you're sanding, you may end up with divots or uneven surfaces like you see here on the top portion of the case. Now it's not the end of the world, but it will take a little more work when you start sanding by hand in order to get rid of those and get a nice even and divot-free surface along the case side. Now, in order to remove the Invicta branding from the crown, I screwed the crown and winding stem back into the case and then put the case back into the vise. Now, you want to be really careful with whatever you use to protect the case when it's in the vise because you don't want to bend or damage the winding stem. Now, the process for removing the branding from the crown would be the same as you see here, gently using the rotary tool evenly and in one direction until the branding on the crown is gone. Now, when it comes to removing the branding from the case back, it's a little bit trickier because you can't use the vise and it's awkward positioning, or I mean, if you manage to use the vise, either way, I didn't use the vise. But you want to be careful when you're sanding that you don't damage the display back crystal that's on this particular case back. But the process is the same as you're seeing here. Once the branding is gone, as you see here, the real labor of love begins, and that is sanding by hand. Now I use a variety of grit sandpaper, working my way from a broader brushed finish to a more fine brushed finish. Generally, to get to a high polish in the finishing stages, you can work your way up to 1,000 grit sandpaper. Now Amazon sells cheap variety packs that will carry the grits that you'd need. You'd start with 400 grit sandpaper, applying pressure evenly and sliding across the case in only one direction. Once you have an even finish in that particular grit, you repeat the process with 600 grit sandpaper until you have an even finish. Then 800 grit sandpaper, and finally I ended with 1,000 grit sandpaper. Now if you have those divots in the case, the best time to get rid of them is to take longer to even out your finish the first time you start hand sanding, which in this instance would have been with the 400 grit sandpaper. Now I used the light on my phone and shined it across the case side to see if it was reflecting evenly across the case side. If I saw any break in the reflection, I kept working the sandpaper across until the reflection of the light was perfect and all the divots are gone. And then I continued working my way up to larger grit sandpaper. Now, the series of sanding with higher and higher grit counts is repeated on both the crown and the case back until I had an even finish with the 1000 grit sandpaper. The most important thing to remember is to be patient. Keep the pressure even and only sand in one direction. If all you're looking for is a nice fine brushed finish, then this is where you would stop. For a polish finish like what I was going for, you want to make sure you use the polishing cloth and or blow on the case to get rid of all the debris, dust, and leftover particles from all the sanding that's been done. Here, I used the Blue Magic polishing cream and rubbed a small amount of it, as per the directions, on the area that I wanted to polish, and then I used the felt wool polishing wheel on the rotary tool and worked my way across the case side. Now you can instantly see that the case side is going to come to a high polish. This process is repeated for any sanded surfaces that you want to bring to a high polish, which in this particular mod was the case side, the crown, and the case back. Now, if you damaged any other parts of the case when you were removing the bezel, for instance, you can sand them as we covered before and bring them to a high polish using this same method. Now, instead of using this polishing cream, you can also try a Dremel polishing wheel attachment. They're pretty cheap on Amazon for a pack of 5, and they will give you a polished finish without needing the metal polishing cream that I used here. And that's because they have something similar infused into the wheel itself. Now, you don't need gloves like the ones I have on here, but because I had small kids around, I wanted to be able to pull them off in a hurry if I needed to without worrying about getting any of the polish cream on the kids. Now, you can use the small polishing cloth to wipe clean the case side and see if you're happy with the finish that you got. Now, while this process can be very time consuming, if you feel like you're unhappy with anything, the beauty is that you can go back to sanding by hand and try again, and try to be patient. Now that we're done with the case, part 3 is going to cover reassembly with all the modded parts. You can click on it now to jump right into it, or you can use the link in the video description. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, let me know below. And if this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. That's it for this one. CG out.